Hey there, before we jump into today's episode, I wanted to be sure to invite you to a free live class I'm teaching March 11th. It's called A Brain First Class for Parents Who Have Tried Everything, and the subtitle really says it all. Learn a brain and nervous system lens that finally explains your child's big behaviors. If you've tried consequences, reward charts, staying calm, being firmer, and you're still left wondering, why is this still happening? This class is for you. It's March 11th at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern, and it will be recorded. So even if you can't make it live, sign up and I will send you the replay. You can register now at go.eileendivine.com/free class. I'd love to have you join us. Alrighty, now let's get into today's episode. I've had parents who have decided to split their household into two homes where one parent lives with the child who's struggling and the other parent lives with the other kids, the siblings in the family. And it's not because the parents were unhappy being married to each other, far from it. They desperately want to be together as a family in the same home, not to mention the financial burden a plan like this entails. But they don't see any other way to keep everyone in the home safe. Hi there, and welcome to the Brain First Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Eileen Devine, and I am a therapist, parent coach, and educator who supports parents that are raising children, teens, and young adults with brain-based differences and challenging behavioral symptoms. If you are a parent or caregiver of a child who has intense, confusing, relentless, or sometimes even scary behaviors, you are in the right place, and I am so glad you're here. Let's get started. Welcome back to the Brain First Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Eileen Devine, and today's episode is about the sibling experience. Now, I know that you already know how hard it is for the other kids in your home when they are living with a brother or sister who really struggles with some very, very challenging behaviors. I know you don't need me or really anyone else pointing that out to you. The parents that I support, the ones that I'm always in conversation with, this is one of their greatest concerns. Their concerns about the well-being of the other kids in the home, the siblings. It is one of their greatest stressors. It is something that keeps them up at night. And I know that many of you listening who have multiple children in your home, you can relate to that. I wanted to record this episode on the sibling experience not to pile on the stress that you already feel about it. I don't want to do that in any way. What I hope this episode will do is provide you with more clarity in terms of what's at play in the dynamic and the impact of it, because when we have clarity, we have a greater ability to make plans. And in this case, make a plan that effectively supports those siblings in your home. Because I know that's what you want to be able to do. Of course it is. But I also know that when you are overwhelmed and when you are buried in sadness and fear and worry surrounding a situation like this, it's really hard to get that clarity. And so then it's really hard to make thoughtful plans. It's really hard to feel like you know what you can actually do about it. So at a minimum, I hope that's what this episode will help you with. I also want to mention before we go too much further that this will be a 2-part series because you know I like to keep these episodes short for you. And there's a lot to be covered here. There's a lot to be said about the sibling experience. So this episode is mainly about the sibling experience, the themes that arise in that experience. And part 2 will be much more about the action that you can take, some steps that you might take to support them. All right. So over the years, I've had many clients share their concerns with me as it relates to this topic, their concerns about the siblings in their home. And they tell me things like, I am so worried about my other kids. They don't get the best of me because their brother, for example, demands all of my time and energy. I know they feel like they're always an afterthought. I feel terrible about it, but I also don't see any way out of it. Or they tell me, I really think that my other kids have PTSD as a result of how their sister behaves. I can't imagine how they couldn't. They've lived basically in a war zone, and I have no idea how to help them. I've had parents who have decided to split their household into two homes where one parent lives with the child who's struggling and the other parent lives with the other kids, the siblings in the family. And it's not because the parents were unhappy being married to each other, far from it. They desperately want to be together as a family in the same home, not to mention the financial burden a plan like this entails. But they don't see any other way to keep everyone in the home safe. So I know that's how hard it is for some of you right now. You're not alone in that. And it's why I think it's really important to be upfront and honest about the intensity and the seriousness of some of your situations so that you know you're not alone in it. And, even if that's not the level of intensity of your home, maybe it's not risen to that level, it's still really, really hard. It doesn't have to be that intense to be very, very hard and honestly devastating as a parent. So with that acknowledgement, I want to begin talking about some common themes in the sibling experience so that we can raise our awareness, right? We can become more aware of what's actually happening. And then again, from there, make more thoughtful, targeted plans with those themes in mind. The first thing that we as parents need to know, and honestly maybe reckon with a bit, is that the sibling experience mirrors the parent experience. What I mean by that is that our attitudes towards our child who is struggling, it will trickle down to their siblings. So if we lead with empathy, for example, they will learn to do this as best they can. If we treat our child as having an illness where there are severe behavioral symptoms that accompany that illness versus the child who is always intentionally ruining everything, their siblings will follow that path of understanding as best they can. We don't need to be perfect here. We just need to be working to consistently use language that is reflective of a brain first lens and consistently parenting from a brain first lens, because that communicates through our actions and through our words that the challenging behaviors their brother or sister experiences are symptoms, right? And reflective of a brain and a nervous system that needs support. Now, let me be clear here. This does not mean we dismiss or ignore what has happened to the sibling. We don't dismiss or ignore their experience. For example, if they are the target of their brother or sister's behavior, or maybe they had yet another outing that they were excited about, ruined by their brother or sister's inability to cope. I'm not suggesting that we dismiss what happened to them, or we minimize it, or we tell them, they shouldn't be experiencing that because their brother or sister has a disability and that's why this is happening. That is not the approach that I am suggesting, not at all. I'm suggesting that it's a both and approach. So we'll talk more about that pretty delicate, sometimes tricky balancing act of the both and in part 2. Okay, another theme in the sibling experience is this pervasive sense of confusion. So, for example, say their brother or sister throws something and breaks it, and because you know that there is nothing productive or positive that will come out of addressing that behavior in the heat of that escalated moment, you plan to circle back. You're going to address it, but you don't do it in that moment. But it leaves the sibling feeling like there are no consequences for that behavior. They view it maybe as a double standard, right? Which is confusing, and it's difficult for any child, even adults, honestly, to fully come to terms with. There are also conflicting feelings. This, I love my brother, but I also hate him. because of how he behaves and how he ruins everything, right? Or these conflicting feelings of guilt that they have, feelings of hate for their brother or sister for something that they know is related to their illness or their disability, or guilt that they are healthy when their sibling is not, right? Feeling embarrassed or ashamed about the way their sibling behaves, feeling sympathy for their brother or sister, but also resentment towards them at the same time. They may know in their logical brain that they have nothing to do with their brother or sister's illness, but they may also feel guilty as though they should be able to do something about it. They may feel fiercely protective of their brother or sister despite, in some cases, experiencing victimization at their hands. These conflicting feelings, it can be really disorienting for that sibling, and it can cause them a lot of emotional angst, understandably. Okay, these next two themes, they pretty much go hand in hand. The first one is one that I hear parents express a lot of concern over, and it's when the sibling in their home does not want to burden them. They don't want to burden their parents with anything because they can see that that parent's plate is already too full with the needs of the brother or sister who struggles. So they work to be perfect in every aspect of their life, and they keep personal worries to themselves. The second related piece of this is what's called parentification. It is where that sibling takes on a parental role. They are usually more independent and more resourceful than their peers out of necessity. They try to control the environment. They may be seen as bossy. And this is a really hard one, another really hard one for parents to reckon with because, of course, it was never their intention that this happened. They don't want this experience for that sibling, and it usually happens slowly over time. They don't want to have their sibling child in that parentified role, yet they realize that's exactly what's taken shape in their home, and they're not sure how to unravel that. Right? So as hard as it may be, it's worth pausing to ask yourself the question, do the siblings in your home believe they are required to take on aspects of a parent or an adult role? Or do they feel like they need to take care of your emotional well-being or your safety? The next piece of the sibling experience that I want to be sure to highlight is the trauma that can sometimes result from living with a brother or sister whose behavior is scary, at times unpredictable. By definition, trauma is the result of extraordinarily stressful events that shatter your sense of security, making you feel helpless and vulnerable, which is unfortunately the experience for some siblings. Now, how someone responds to trauma, it's personal, it's individualized. It may look like hypervigilance, like always being on guard or on edge. Their subconscious, constantly anticipating danger. It could look more like anxiety or irritability, lashing out, withdrawal, depression. So you'll want to sit with this for a minute and see what that might look like for your sibling child if you believe this has been part of their experience. Here's the other thing I want to be sure you hear about this. If you know that trauma has been a part of the experience for the siblings in your home, how well someone recovers from trauma is also personalized and individualized, depending on what we call the protective factors in their life. So we'll get back to that in part 2. But I want to make sure you hear that now because it can be devastating to come to terms with the fact that this has been a part of your child's experience in relation to their brother or sister who struggles. It can leave parents feeling pretty helpless. So you are not helpless. There are things that you can do to add to those protective factors, and we will talk more about that in part 2. The last theme of the sibling experience is grief. Now, we've talked about grief on this podcast before, and in fact, I'd encourage you to go listen to the episode that we did on parental grief. But what I'd encourage you to do is listen to it in the context of the sibling experience. Keep their experience in mind as you're listening to that podcast episode. It will all apply. So it's episode 22, and I'll be sure to include it in the show notes as well, so you have it there. We talk in that episode about grief being the loss of what will not be. Longing for what you hoped for and now know may not be possible. and feeling lost or feeling disoriented. This is another heartbreaking one to have to really sit with as a parent. It's also really hard to support your sibling child through their own grief if you've not worked through your grief first. Like really, really hard. So we'll touch on that again in part 2 because it's such an important step for parents to take that we need to be sure to really highlight. Okay, the point in touching on each of these themes, that the sibling experience mirrors the parent experience, this pervasive sense of confusion and conflicting feelings, not wanting to be a burden, perfectionism, parentification, trauma, grief. The point of all of this is to remind ourselves of what, as I said in the beginning, I know you already know, but we need to be reminded of it, which is that siblings are not passive observers, that their nervous systems are working really hard to organize around the unpredictability of their brother or sister's behavioral symptoms, and these are some of the ways that it bubbles up to the surface. I know that as we wrap up this episode, you may have more fear or worry or sadness about this really hard dynamic than you did when you hit play. It's hard to hear all of this. It's hard to sit with it and reflect on it. I know. That's why I want to remind you again that we'll have a part 2 where we will talk about the steps you can consider taking to help the other kids in your home. Now, you know I don't promise overnight fixes because I do not believe they exist. But what I can say is that there are ways that parents of children with challenging behaviors can work to minimize the impact of that child's behavior on the siblings who are witness to them, maybe even the target of them at times. So I'm looking forward to talking more about that in part 2. So with that, I'll talk with you again next time. And until then, take care. Before we say goodbye, I want to be sure that you are aware of all the free resources I've created with you and parents like you in mind. You can access them all in one place at go.eileendivine.com/free resources.